Okay, I think I figured out my technical issues here. Welcome. We're doing every Monday at 10:02 a.m. I'm going over what I'm calling a quick missional moment for Redeemer East Side. And what we are doing is we're just asking the question during this time, rather than asking, how do we get back to normal? We are asking, what would it look like if we started to say, how do we emerge from all of this transformed? So more compassionate, more humble, more purposeful. If you were with us last week, we talked about these 5 practices of peace, and we are going to be looking at each one of those in turn. Those 5 practices, we believe, if you keep those practices, you will not only draw closer to God in this time, but you will also be sent out deeper into the world. So those 5 practices, just to review, we'll do this each time, is P for pause, A for ask, or E for eat, sorry, A for ask, C for commune, and E for examine. So today we're looking at the practice of pause, which is really the keeping of a Sabbath. Now you might ask, well, for all this, these missional practices, this missional moment, why start with the practice of pause? Aren't we trying to engage in practices that send us out deeper into the world? And I actually think starting with the practice of pause is critical. Here's why. If you look at the early chapters of Genesis in the creation account, what I love about that is, if you remember, God creates Adam and Eve on day 6. And what that means is God creates Adam and Eve, and remember, it gives them this great commission, this great mandate to fill the earth, to subdue it. And after having received this mandate, they go to bed, and the next morning they wake up, and it's the Sabbath. And for the first 24 hours of their existence, after given all this responsibility, this great scope of possibility, their first task is to explore the garden in wonder, to simply marvel and delight at all that God has placed in the garden for them. And so the purpose of that Sabbath was to begin with delight. So we don't come to the practice of Sabbath keeping with a mentality of, I've done all this work, my battery's drained, and therefore I need to recharge. No, we actually begin with the fullness of Sabbath, the delight, the wonder, the joy of Sabbath. And it's that delight and wonder that propels us into the world. But most importantly, we start with a Sabbath because we need to begin by re-rooting ourselves in the gospel of grace. It's the reminder every week that we are saved not by what we do, but by what God has done for us. That the Sabbath says, on the day when I've produced nothing for God, that's the day when I experience the love of God in the most tangible way. And so it reminds us that all these practices and all this seeking to live on mission, they cannot become the new legalism. They cannot become the new works righteousness. We root ourselves in the gospel of grace. We begin in peace. We begin in rest. And so that's why we begin with a practice of pause. Now, how do we create a practice of Sabbath in a time when all of our boundaries are blurred? How do you create a practice of Sabbath when you work and you teach your kids, maybe for some of you, you sleep and you eat all in the same place in a time of blurred boundaries? How do we begin to keep a Sabbath? And that's a really important question. It's one that I've been wrestling with personally myself. So I don't know that I have all the answers, but I can begin to share with you some of the things that we've done to begin to practice Sabbath, to start by pausing in the week during this time. So the first thing we did is we selected a day that we would call our Sabbath. So for us, we've selected Saturday as the day that we keep the Sabbath. Now, what we do on that day, the first rule that we implemented, and we're kind of spotty in keeping this, but we said we wanted to have a day where there are no personal devices. Now, that might sound crazy, especially because everything right now is on screens. But the distinction we made in no devices is no devices that isolate. So that means we try to stay off of our phones. We try to stay off of any personal music devices, any kind of screen time or digital time. We want it to be time that draws us together as a family. So that might be a movie, or it might be family games online that we play together. But we're trying to draw ourselves away from the screens that are necessary, and yet we also need that Sabbath from it. So we've picked Saturdays as a full day. We've said no personal devices on that day. So we're trying to shift everything to physical. So even our scripture reading that day, I normally use a Redeemer devotional on my computer, but on that day, moving over to reading a physical Bible. And the third thing that we started to do again is to light a Sabbath candle. So we just bought a big candle and we put it in the middle of our apartment and we light that candle at the beginning of the day. And it's just kind of a visual and even uh, I don't know, olfactory, a smelling reminder that this day is different. We set it apart and we keep it as a Sabbath. We're also going to try to use this day as a day where we try to get out as a family, out of doors and, social distancing and with masks, but just to change the pace. And my wife and I are also trying to figure out how do we create Sabbath time for one another in the midst where all this is crazy. So pick a day, create some structure around it, get separated from devices, but most importantly, let it be a day of delight. Where you're reorienting yourselves to God, you're reorienting yourself to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, I know some of you are essential workers, and so the challenge of creating a Sabbath, if you're an essential worker, is quite different, isn't it? And when this all started, for you, it very much was all hands on deck, emergency mode. And now, as the week's gone on, you, for many weeks now, have been feeling that this is not a sustainable pace. So if you're an essential worker, I want to challenge you and really encourage you, find a way to practice a normal Sabbath. You might have to speak to your supervisor, other people who are relying on you. But in order for you to sustain your work over time, find a way to keep a Sabbath. Find a way to reorient yourself to the love of God in Jesus Christ. Find a way to reorient yourself to delight and wonder, even in the midst of really, really trying times. So that's the first practice. What we're going to do is every week after we do this on Thursday evenings, we're going to have a 30-minute Zoom call. It's going to be a Q&A because obviously 4 or 5 minutes on a Monday is not enough to get into all the details. But we hope you'll join us there for Q&A to get into some of the practicals of this. If you go to eastside.redeemer.com/missional moments, you will find how you can hop onto that Zoom call, or you can call in with a phone as well. So today probably went much longer than I intended it to, but pause. That's the first practice to keep if you want to structure our days and weeks to draw us closer to God and also send us deeper into the world. Next week, we'll be looking at the practice of eating and how God can use that for spiritual renewal as well. Thanks for joining.